Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Sandoval, and my work is about effectively communicating across difference and difficulty. And today I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about difficult conversations and managing our communicative choices during conflict and those kinds of crisis moments that are becoming all too common a part of our lived experiences. First, we're going to talk about what a difficult conversation is. What does this look like? How are we making communicative choices? How can we engage in active listening and also thinking through some strategies for mindful engagement, and then some information about how to contact me if you have further questions about this work. This is a poster that is meant to look like those inspirational posters that we used to find in our offices in the 90s, but it's the opposite of an inspirational poster. But I think it speaks to this particular moment. One of the reasons I am making this short video today is because of the number of times I've been asked recently how we can do this better. How can we engage in all of these difficult dialogues that we're being asked to enter into? Because we're being continually faced by challenges and learning and unlearning about our history, about justice, and about our own experiences and the things that we may not have understood about the experiences of others. So I thought that this was appropriate here in the summer of 2020 to think about these challenges. I expected times like this, but I never thought they'd be so bad, so long, and so frequent. And I think a lot of people are really feeling that intimately at this particular moment. And I just want to recognize across a lot of areas of identity, difference, and positionality, some people have been feeling that way for much, much longer than this particular moment. And that's really the space that we have to enter into and flex those empathy muscles and work on being compassionate while also finding a way to show some grace to ourselves and to others as we continue to work through this difficulty together. So when we're faced with a difficult moment, I want you to think through a couple of questions. I want you to look at a difficult moment as a space that has potential for conflict. And what are the things that you think about even when I just use the word conflict? What happens to your body when you're faced with conflict, when you find yourself being confronted or you're in a difficult conversation? What happens to your thoughts during that experience? What happens to your feelings? And finally, how does your behavior look in response to all those things that are happening in your body, in your mind, and in your heart? I know for me, when I'm faced with a difficult situation, with confrontation, with conflict, I'm always the very most gracious and articulate and thoughtful and intentional version of myself. I am absolutely not that. If you thought that I was being serious because you can't see my face anymore, that's ridiculous. Most of us are not, right? When we are faced with conflict or confrontation and these tough conversations, we generally have a lot of things going on in all of these different parts of us. We are dealing with a fight, flight, or flee response, right? Or freeze response. We are actually experiencing a crisis in our bodies. And so first, just by acknowledging that, we can be better prepared for making communicative choices and using better strategies when we find ourselves in those situations. So some potential reactions, right? Physiological reactions to these experiences. Our heart rate may increase. We might start sweating. We can actually feel disoriented. Some people get nauseous. Our whole body might tighten up. You can get a headache instantaneously. Your body might shake. Your voice might shake, right? These are completely natural responses to those moments. And that also means that mentally and emotionally, we're experiencing stress. We might actually feel anger. We might feel afraid. For a lot of us, it's anxiety inducing. And we have lots of frustration. We might experience emotional flooding, right? Just an overwhelming sensation of a particular feeling or multiple feelings. or we might not even be able to identify the very emotions that we are experiencing. Again, these are natural human reactions to conflict and to difficulty. So we got to not be quite so hard on ourselves if that's what we are experiencing when faced with this. We can work to be better at identifying the things that create these situations for us and ultimately work on strategies to walk through these towards management of the situation and maybe even resolution. First, I want to remind you a little bit about the Iceberg Model, which is applied to myriad concepts. And so I'm just going to use it here to talk about the fact that oftentimes when we are in conflict, because it's really ruled by perception, we're missing a big part of the picture, right? Whatever issue that seems to be on the surface, that can very well be incredibly important. It can be the most salient thing. But some of the things that we're not seeing have to do with our own personalities, our communication styles, the feelings we're having, a lot of our interests or needs at that particular moment. It might have to do with our self-concept, which is a very individualistic and US-centric perspective. It might have to do with some hidden expectations about a relationship, about a communication, about any kind of interaction that you're having. And it also might be informed by negative history or actual trauma, right? And these are really important things to consider. It's kind of like that thing that, maybe you had a parent or a caretaker tell you, it's easy to get mad at somebody when they are racing around you on the highway and driving really fast and they cut you off and you just think you're such a jerk and you ruined my whole day, and they try to tell you you don't know what's going on, they could be rushing to the hospital, right? Which is kind of like a simple little moral of the story thing that we often hear when we're younger, but can be really valuable perspective to think about when we're engaged in a difficult conversation or encounter that likely we don't know very much at all, and certainly we don't have a lot of information about people, even if we think we know them well, that can impact that interaction. So what do we do when we're thinking about our communicative choices when we're faced with a difficult situation, right? We have to ask ourselves what's at stake. A lot of people who are conflict avoidant, and I have a master's degree in dispute resolution, and I would not say that I am not conflict avoidant, right? And that has to do with a lot of my orientation of seeing conflict as a risk to relationship, a risk to reputation. And it can be very difficult for me, even in circumstances where that vulnerability might be imagined, to work past that, right? So you have to think a little bit about what are the stakes, and am I being realistic about the stakes? Because maybe the stakes are the feelings of others, justice, right? There can be really important things at stake, educational opportunities to correct somebody's misunderstanding or problematic view of people around you. You want to ask, who do you want to be? This isn't kind of a big question about who do you want to be in your life and in the world, but more about in that moment, which has to do sometimes with our capacity, right? There are some times where I have so much capacity to engage in a difficult conversation, or I just feel like, yes, I'm here for this and I am ready to be present and engage. And there are some times where I think, my capacity is challenged at the moment, and I don't have a lot of grace for this person or this circumstance, and maybe I shouldn't engage, right? You got to make that choice. And then what aspects of identity are present? How does privilege and power and positionality come into play? So my primary role is being a professor, an instructor in a university setting, right? There is no situation where I'm dealing with my students where power and positionality is not at play. And oftentimes I need to consider those things before I make choices about how to communicate and how I can make a decision to show compassion or not in a particular scenario. So those are some kind of bigger questions, but some tactical questions that we talk about, particularly when it comes to conflict, but really about all kinds of communication strategies. is you want to ask yourself, what is the issue? What is the thing that we are in disagreement or in perceived disagreement about? What is my relationship to this person? Again, that power, privilege, and positionality come into play, but also, is this a long-term trusting relationship? Is this a short-term relationship where I don't really have to think about managing the long-term implications? Is this something that will impact our ongoing relationship in a way that is either positive or negative? How can I take that into consideration? And then, of course, in the work that I do, there's always something that is so important in addition to identity, and that is context. What is the context in which you're having this discussion or engaged in this conflict? Whatever it might be, you have to think about the micro context of literally, where are you? What is the environment? Is the environment conducive to having an effective conversation and effective engagement? And you have to think about the larger context. At this particular moment that I'm making this recording, most people are experiencing a relentless and really overwhelming amount of stress at a level that our bodies are just not made to manage very effectively. A lot of uncertainty and a lot of trauma. And so it's really important to not just think about the context that you can see right there that you're experiencing, but also the larger context of what people are living through in that particular moment. And these three questions can help us make much smarter and better and more compassionate and often more equitable decisions about how we're going to communicate across difficulty. Something that people always say is, how do we become better listeners? And I will say that activating our ability to listen is one of the most important components of engaging in effective, difficult conversation. Oftentimes we point to this LARC model, L-A-R-C. So that's a quick way to try to remember this. And that is to say that we always start with listening, right? That can be one of the most important first steps we take in engaging across difference and difficulty, is to listen. And I'm going to talk about some strategies to do that mindfully in a minute. We also want to acknowledge, right? We want to validate and make sure that the person or persons that we are in communication with know that we are present and that we can at least validate and acknowledge their narrative and their experience, even if ultimately we disagree with the perspective about something that they're sharing. We can always validate someone's own experience. Only after we listen and acknowledge and validate do we even start to consider responding, right? A lot of times when we're engaged in a tough conversation, we're getting a defensive posture right away. We're running through our arguments, we're looking for facts in the back of our mind, and we're just thinking, I'm coming up with the best response ever. I can't wait for it to be my turn. And we're ultimately enormously distracted by all of that cognitive activity, and we're getting wound up, right? But if we pause and go through other steps first and respond thoughtfully and intentionally, that is a really important component of active listening, of being present. And finally, we want to commit. We want to commit to the active listening. We want to commit to the effort that it takes to engage this mindfully. Some additional things to consider when we talk about mindful engagement. If there's nothing else you take away from this, then I hope you remember this phrase: seek first to understand, then to be understood. This is an incredibly important reminder that if our priority, if the outcome that we want in every interaction is for other people to understand us, we're probably missing a lot of that opportunity to listen and acknowledge and to engage and to better understand others. And if we start with that open space of looking to understand the lived experience, the perspective, the life and positionality of others, and then when there's an opening to share things that will help them understand us, it shifts the dynamic. And if we're all doing that simultaneously, it's such a different kind of conflict, such a different kind of communicative event. It is not easy. I'm saying remember this as if it's just the most simplest thing in the world, right? It's not. And I want to validate that and recognize it, but it is a valuable perspective. Next, in terms of that active listening and that acknowledgement, you want to attend. And so this is kind of the cheesy perspective, and it's totally fine if there's some eye rolling happening, but this means listening with your eyes, ears, and heart. It means being open to everything that's being said and hearing and listening beyond words in whatever manner those may be coming through. Being able to listen beyond sometimes the tone or the frustration or the environment that might be making you a little bit cranky, and to really center yourself and focus on what the other person is trying to communicate to you. That acknowledgement can look like restating or summarizing. You might just literally say, all right, let me play it back for you to make sure that I understand what you're saying. Because oftentimes that's when we come to identify the misunderstanding that's occurred. I cannot emphasize enough that silence is okay. Particularly in the dominant culture in the United States, we have a real tendency to try to fill the space. So we start responding right away. We don't think it makes us look smart or competent often to take a moment to process and reflect. But silence can be a really important moment for those things to actually transpire and to become comfortable in the silence, to become comfortable with the vulnerability of saying, hey, I need a minute. I don't think I can respond as thoughtfully as I would like to if I don't take a minute to process and think a little bit. Because if you've been listening in the most effective way, you have not been thinking about your response at all. So you might need a beat. Take it. We can absolutely acknowledge ignorance. We can say, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And we need to learn to become okay with that. And finally, we need to ask better questions. We need to really engage with a mind of curiosity about the experiences of those around us and figure out how to be sincere and empathetic and cultivate a real skill in getting to understand the experience of others. So what do you do with those feelings during all of this mindful engagement, all of this attending, right? A lot of times people say, well, in conflict, you really want to focus on the issues and get those feelings out of the way. I say the opposite. If you don't deal with the feelings and the emotions that are present, they will get in the way. They are in the way. People, human beings, are the ones who are in this conflict. We need to get to a space where we can bring our whole selves to our work environments, to our learning environments, to our relationship environments. And we need to figure out how to own our own feelings, or they will own us, right? So one of the first things that I always encourage my students to do is to increase our emotional vocabulary. What happens is a lot of times we actually have a pretty limited range of words to describe the way that we feel. And this also limits our ability to identify complex emotional states. We can feel more than one thing at one time. And if we're able to understand all of the variations and ranges of particular feelings, that can help us get better at identifying our own emotional state, which helps us become better at communicating it, right? And that can be a critical way through difficulty in conversation, when we can clearly and intentionally say, this is the way that I'm feeling right now. And I am uncomfortable with this feeling, or this feeling is painful, or I want to move away from this feeling or ignore it. But really identifying it, being able to label it and work with it and through it can be truly powerful when we engage in difficult conversation. So a couple of things to remember about conflict and difficult conversations. These are spaces that are born out of difference. And that's important because difference matters. And we need to create space for difference. Conflict is not inherently negative, but it is inevitable. So we can harness that for educational opportunities, learning moments. It can be relational. It can change the nature of a relationship. Oftentimes we think negatively, but also have enormously positive benefits. Oftentimes conflict unfolds over time, differences emerge over time, and they might take us by surprise, but we should pay attention to those shifts. And conflict and difficulty is absolutely shaped by perception. What we perceive to be is what is. And so we have to make sure that we are able to clearly communicate our perception of events and clearly communicate our feelings about that so that we can actually engage in meaningful dialogue about it. One of my favorite quotes about conflict is that it is the beginning of consciousness. And I really do see conflict as difficult and uncomfortable and stressful as it can be, as a space for tremendous opportunity, for change, for growth, even for justice in a lot of our spaces. And I hope that you can come to see it the same way. If you have more questions or want to talk about more strategies, specifically in your own spaces, please feel free to reach out. My email is listed here. You can also go to my website, which is my name, jennifersandoval.com. I look forward to continuing to partner with you in increasing our capacity to communicate effectively across difference and difficulty.